The hull had already passed the depth most officers preferred not to name. Steel flexed without complaint, not because it was comfortable, but because it had been built to accept strain as a condition rather than a warning. Inside the boat, movement was minimal and deliberate. Valves were set and left alone. Hands learned where to rest without transmitting vibration. Air circulated in a way that felt thicker with every moment, not because it had changed composition, but because the awareness of confinement tightened perception. Above, the surface had ceased to exist as space and had become a ceiling of intent, marked by converging screws, structured sweeps, and a certainty that the target below was cornered. The hunt had already settled into procedure. The first depth charge altered the environment before it was heard. Pressure displaced water outward, then folded it back against the hull in a heavy, deliberate motion. Fixtures trembled, not violently, but with enough insistence to remind the crew that survival depended on margins that were never generous. Insulation exhaled dust. Loose objects completed their final movements and came to rest. No orders were spoken. Nothing external was required. The sequence was already internalized, trained through repetition into muscle memory. When additional charges followed, their spacing carried meaning. This was not improvisation. It was method. The destroyers above did not rush. They did not need to. Contact had been held. Patterns had been calculated. The assumption was simple and comfortable. A submerged vessel under pressure would maneuver. It would attempt to slip laterally, to gain distance, to exploit intervals in coverage. Doctrine promised that reaction itself could be exploited. The surface force acted accordingly, placing force where the response was expected to appear. The water between hull and blast became saturated with organized violence, layered not to search, but to confirm. Inside the boat, perception narrowed. Sound collapsed into identifiable categories rather than individual cues. Pumps became baseline. Metal became language. Every change carried meaning, but meaning did not require interpretation beyond acknowledgement. The crew measured the hunt not by counting detonations, but by feeling the rhythm between them. It was even, predictable, confident. The enemy was acting as though time itself belonged to them. What followed was not movement in the traditional sense. There was no abrupt change in angle, no surge of speed, no visible attempt to escape. Ballast was adjusted incrementally. Planes were angled to accept, not resist. The boat allowed itself to descend beyond the range that most commanders considered defensible. This choice had never been fashionable. It was described in training rooms as unnecessary exposure, as surrendering flexibility in exchange for silence that could never be absolute. It violated the belief that survival depended on continuous evasion. It replaced action with tolerance. That substitution had been dismissed as dangerous. The deeper the hull settled, the more the surrounding water altered the hunt without announcing the change. Sound paths bent and loosened. Shock waves lost definition as they traveled through layers that absorbed and diffused force unevenly. Echoes returned with softened edges, less certain of their origin. The environment itself began to intervene, not on behalf of either side, but according to rules indifferent to intent. Above, the destroyers adjusted patterns without questioning premise. Coverage widened and tightened at the same time, a contradiction resolved through repetition rather than analysis. Charges continued to fall. Their placement reflected belief more than observation. The assumption that the target would attempt to regain favorable depth remained intact. The unseen vessel was treated as damaged, stressed, or preparing a desperate ascent. The hunt evolved around those possibilities. Inside the boat, stillness became effort. Every instinct urged reaction. Every training exercise rewarded motion. Yet nothing changed because nothing needed to. The decision was not to defeat detection, but to outlast procedure. Pressure increased along predictable lines. Structural members accepted load as designed. Stress approached tolerances that existed more often in engineering discussions than in operational reality, and then stabilized. There was no romance in this endurance, no gesture toward heroism. It was the quiet fulfillment of design expectation. Machines behaved as they had been calculated to behave. Humans limited themselves to observation and restraint. The hull did not protest. It complied. As time extended without reference, the surface force began to consume its own clarity. Each detonation disturbed water already unsettled. Acoustic returns degraded incrementally, not enough to prompt alarm, but enough to introduce uncertainty that could not be resolved through additional force. Reports acknowledged likelihood rather than certainty. Coordination required more correction. The absence of confirmation was interpreted as concealment rather than absence. The hunt persisted because disengagement while belief remained implied error, and error had no place in the system directing events above. Eventually, depth charges detonated farther from the boat's true position, not because it had moved, but because expectation had shifted. Explosions broke where the target was presumed to be rather than where it remained. Their energy dispersed before reaching the hull, muted by distance and absorption. What had once been threat became indication. Each blast further degraded the very medium the destroyers depended upon for clarity. Inside the hull, conditions changed only marginally. Air grew warmer. Moisture accumulated. Instruments reflected strain honestly, without exaggeration. Metal flexed within limits that design teams had specified, but crews rarely had cause to trust. Nothing dramatic occurred. Nothing resolved. The absence of consequence became the defining feature of the engagement. Above, the hunt slowed without announcement. Patterns lost cohesion as vessels responded individually to internal thresholds rather than collective certainty. Fuel considerations surfaced quietly. Priorities elsewhere asserted themselves. The surface force did not concede failure. It simply adjusted focus. The sea returned to relative neutrality, carrying no declaration, only the residue of disturbed water and incomplete conviction. The boat remained still long after external pressure receded. Movement was delayed not from fear, but calculation. Any ascent restored interaction with a system whose assumptions, though weakened, had not yet collapsed. The same logic that had governed descent governed patience. When the hull finally rose, it did so incrementally and without emphasis. No alarms marked success. Nothing inside the boat improved dramatically. Survival was defined entirely by continuation. In later assessments, the encounter resisted classification. There was no dramatic escape, no decisive maneuver to celebrate. What stood out was the deviation from expected behavior and the consequence of that deviation when repeated pressure met sustained tolerance. The destroyers had not been deceived. They had been allowed to exhaust the utility of their own certainty. The escape was not accomplished through cleverness alone, but through alignment with how systems degrade under prolonged assertion. The method had been dismissed because it appeared passive. In reality, it demanded more discipline than aggressive evasion. It required trust in material limits and acceptance of discomfort without visible progress. It reduced interaction rather than complicating it, allowing the opposing force to operate within assumptions that gradually lost validity. The more force was applied above, the less informative the environment became, and the more the submerged vessel benefited simply by remaining intact. Such outcomes did not provoke immediate reform. They accumulated quietly as unresolved hunts, each one catalogued without clear conclusion. Surface forces interpreted them as anomalies influenced by local conditions. Submerged crews absorbed a different lesson, transmitted indirectly through altered behavior rather than formal instruction. Silence was tolerated longer. Depth was reconsidered as variable rather than boundary. Endurance was accepted as an operational response rather than a failure of initiative. The significance of these encounters did not lie in spectacle, but in repetition. The method required nothing beyond what already existed. It depended on predictability rather than surprise. Each time a hunt dissolved without resolution, the logic governing pursuit weakened incrementally. Systems optimized for detection proved vulnerable to environments shaped by their own excess. Pressure intended to compel motion instead rewarded stillness when applied beyond optimal thresholds. This imbalance favored those who demanded less from the environment. The surface force required confirmation to justify continuation. The submerged vessel required only persistence. As engagements multiplied, unresolved outcomes shaped planning horizons without ever announcing themselves as change. Resource allocation adjusted subtly. Confidence softened. Certainty became more expensive to pursue. In this context, survival without destruction carried strategic weight. Each intact hull preserved capability and compelled the opponent to account for threats that could not be eliminated on schedule. The absence of dramatic outcome did not diminish influence. It redistributed it over time, affecting tempo and expectation across a broader theater. The depth endurance escape endured not because it was daring, but because it aligned behavior with physical reality rather than doctrinal comfort. It accepted that control could not always be forced through action, and that environments do not reward intensity indefinitely. By refusing to participate in expected reactions, the submerged vessel shifted the engagement into asymmetry, where endurance imposed limits on aggression. The sea itself remained indifferent, absorbing energy and ambiguity alike. Under its pressure, systems behaved exactly as they had been designed to behave. What failed was interpretation. The destroyers gave up not out of defeat, but because continuation no longer promised clarity. That withdrawal mattered. It preserved the hunted and redistributed effort elsewhere, altering future encounters invisibly. The pattern that emerged from such moments did not rewrite doctrine outright. It softened certainty. It introduced hesitation where procedure had once felt absolute. Over time, endurance became recognized not as the absence of action, but as a form of influence that constrained the opponent's ability to resolve engagement on demand. In the depths, beneath measured steel and accumulated pressure, survival asserted itself quietly as consequence rather than victory, leaving systems above to adjust without ever admitting why. Pressure did not disappear when the surface force withdrew. It redistributed. The absence of explosions sharpened awareness rather than easing it. Inside the hull, the crew adjusted to a different form of strain, one defined not by immediate assault, but by the uncertainty of whether withdrawal was complete or merely masked. Silence carried its own weight. It forced attention inward, toward gauges that changed slowly and sounds that arrived without context. The decision to remain motionless persisted because motion itself would have restored predictability to the encounter. Above, the destroyers moved away along courses that reflected responsibility rather than doubt. Each vessel departed under its own rationale. Fuel state, orders elsewhere, diminishing confidence framed as operational prudence. There was no dramatic acknowledgement that the hunt had failed. In the language of procedure, it had simply ceased to justify its continuation. The distinction mattered on paper, but it altered nothing beneath the waterline, where the result was measured only by continued existence. The environment that had once amplified threat now acted as buffer. Disturbed layers settled slowly. Particulate matter remained suspended, softening any signal that passed through it. Sound returned to a condition closer to baseline, though never fully neutral. The sea retained memory in motion and temperature, holding traces of the engagement long after intent had faded. This persistence favored the vessel that demanded nothing further from it. When the ascent resumed, it was a process rather than a maneuver. Small adjustments accumulated over time. Ballast shifted incrementally. Control surfaces responded without emphasis. No change was permitted that could be interpreted as urgency. The boat rose through layers shaped by earlier violence, passing through regions where detection might have resumed had any observer remained to impose it. None did. The threat had already been reallocated. Inside, human response mirrored mechanical discipline. There was no release of tension that could be mistaken for relief. Endurance did not conclude the moment danger receded. It unwound gradually, measured by the return of routine rather than celebration. Systems were checked without commentary. Spaces remained dim. Air circulation normalized slowly. Nothing announced success. The absence of consequence remained the only evidence that mattered. Beyond the immediate encounter, this outcome resisted translation into official lesson. Reports captured sequence, but not implication. They described patterns executed and contact lost, without framing disappearance as result. The emphasis remained on what had been done rather than what had been exhausted. For surface forces accustomed to equating effort with effect, this framing preserved institutional coherence at the cost of comprehension. Below, interpretation moved differently. Crews who experienced such engagements learned to recognize procedural fatigue above them. They detected it through changes in rhythm, spacing, and eventual disengagement rather than through explicit signals. These observations circulated informally, shaping expectations without codifying doctrine. Endurance became less controversial because it produced survivable outcomes without demanding recognition. The systems on either side of the engagement diverged in their relationship to time. For the surface force, time represented cost and diminishing return. Each additional moment without resolution increased exposure elsewhere and risked inefficiency. For the submerged vessel, time stabilized conditions. Stress reached plateaus rather than escalated indefinitely. Familiarity replaced novelty. What had been perceived as danger settled into tolerable strain. This asymmetry shaped decision-making in ways that formal analysis struggled to express. The intent to dominate through continuous pressure encountered limits imposed not by opposition, but by the medium itself. Water did not reward persistence beyond certain thresholds. Beyond those thresholds, assertive action degraded perception faster than it constrained possibility. The boat beneath the surface relied on this principle without needing to articulate it. Such encounters accumulated as unresolved data points. Individually, none demanded immediate correction. Collectively, they altered expectations slowly. Surface commanders encountered an increasing frequency of engagements that ended without confirmation. Each one required explanation that deferred certainty rather than reasserted it. Over time, this deferral influenced how aggressively resources were committed to prolonged hunts whose outcomes could not be guaranteed. Within submarine forces, confidence developed along different lines. It was not confidence in invulnerability, but in predictability of system behavior under sustained load. Hulls responded as designed. Life support functions remained stable when managed conservatively. The environment imposed limits that, while severe, could be endured more reliably than previously assumed. This understanding reduced reliance on reactive tactics that sought immediate relief at the cost of increased exposure.
The depth endurance method remained unattractive to narratives focused on decisive action. It offered no dramatic arc, no clear moment of reversal that could be highlighted. Yet precisely because it denied spectacle, it escaped scrutiny that might have constrained its adoption. It persisted as a practical response, repeated when circumstances permitted, discarded only when structural limits demanded movement. As the war continued, the relationship between force and certainty grew less direct. Technologies promised improved detection and coordination, yet their effectiveness depended on environments that retained clarity. When that clarity eroded, escalation revealed its own inefficiencies. Additional charge patterns increased disturbance without restoring interpretive advantage. The same mechanisms designed to reveal became sources of obfuscation. In this context, endurance imposed a subtle form of control. By remaining within conditions that degraded the opponent's perception, the submerged vessel constrained the decisions available above. It forced withdrawal without confrontation. It compelled reallocation without admission. This control did not manifest as authority, but as limitation, narrowing the opponent's capacity to conclude engagement on acceptable terms. The sea continued to absorb these interactions without record. It offered no feedback beyond altered conditions that persisted long enough to influence outcome. Systems that aligned themselves with this behavior endured more often than those that attempted to override it continuously. Each unresolved hunt reinforced this alignment without requiring acknowledgement. From a broader perspective, such moments reshaped maritime conflict below the threshold of doctrinal change. They demonstrated that superiority depended not only on power applied, but on the sustainability of its application. Aggression carried its own attrition when extended beyond productive intervals. Patience, though less visible, preserved capability and imposed costs indirectly. The depth escape that had been dismissed as impossible did not challenge authority openly. It simply refused to produce the reaction authority relied upon. In doing so, it exposed a dependency within the pursuing system on resolution and confirmation. When those could not be achieved, continuation lost justification. Withdrawal followed quietly, framed as choice rather than concession. This pattern did not promise inevitability. Structural failure remained a risk. Human error remained unforgiving. Endurance was not immunity. It was a calculated acceptance of strain that replaced immediacy with duration. Where doctrine favored reaction, endurance favored restraint. Where expectation favored motion, endurance favored stillness. This divergence shaped outcomes without announcing itself. As such encounters became part of operational memory, they influenced planning without formal endorsement. Engagement models expanded to include unresolved outcomes as acceptable conclusions rather than failures. The certainty that every contact could be forced into clarity diminished. In its place grew an acceptance of ambiguity as an operational condition that had to be managed rather than eliminated. The destroyers that disengaged carried forward altered assumptions, even if unspoken. The inability to compel reaction began to register as a limitation rather than a temporary setback. Over time, this influenced thresholds for pursuit and willingness to exhaust resources against targets that resisted definition. The submerged vessel benefited from this shift simply by continuing to exist. In the depths, beneath pressure that accumulated predictably, the logic of endurance asserted itself without declaration. Survival remained unremarkable. It produced no signal, no debris, no confirmation. It left behind only the quiet absence of consequence, forcing systems built on action to adjust to the reality that some engagements could not be resolved through force alone. The implications of that adjustment did not surface immediately. They accumulated across patrol cycles and after-action summaries that spoke in neutral language about contacts that dissolved without explanation. Each account preserved institutional confidence by avoiding attribution of cause. The sea was cited. Conditions were cited. Probability was cited. What was not cited was the emerging pattern that persistence no longer guaranteed comprehension. For organizations structured around resolution, this omission mattered more than any tactical outcome. Below the surface, crews internalized a different expectation. They learned that absence could operate as presence, that remaining within a hostile envelope without reacting could impose constraints on the pursuer that no maneuver could achieve. Stillness, when paired with tolerance for pressure, removed variables instead of multiplying them. Fewer changes meant fewer signals. Fewer signals meant fewer opportunities for misinterpretation to be corrected through force. The system above continued to act. The system below simply endured. This endurance altered the psychological balance of future hunts before they began. Surface commanders entered engagements aware that confirmation might not be obtained, no matter how thorough the search. This awareness introduced caution that doctrine did not explicitly sanction but could not suppress. Decisions about fuel expenditure, coverage duration, and coordination were filtered through the possibility of unresolved conclusion. That possibility consumed attention even when it was not expressed. The submarine crews sensed this caution indirectly. They perceived it in the tempo of pursuit that escalated and then plateaued rather than intensifying indefinitely. They observed how patterns repeated with diminishing variation, signaling procedural commitment absent adaptive insight. Fatigue above manifested as predictability. What had once been threat now revealed itself as routine, and routine could be mapped even without direct visibility. Engineering considerations grew more prominent as a result. Hull integrity, pressure distribution, and material fatigue ceased to be abstract topics confined to design reviews. They became operational variables that crews monitored continuously. Endurance depended not on courage, but on fidelity to limits. The capacity to remain within those limits under extended strain became a form of competence that did not announce itself through action. The relationship between human agency and machine behavior shifted subtly. Success flowed less from decisive intervention than from restraint exercised consistently over time. Command within the hull emphasized regulation rather than initiative. Systems were trusted to respond predictably if left undisturbed. This trust reduced cognitive load during prolonged exposure, preserving clarity where reaction might have eroded it. Above the surface, the burden ran in the opposite direction. Command demanded continuous affirmation through activity, yet activity increasingly yielded ambiguity. Each action designed to reduce uncertainty compounded environmental distortion that could not be reversed on demand. The effort to impose order generated noise that overwhelmed interpretation. The resulting gap between exertion and outcome strained assumptions at the core of pursuit doctrine. This gap widened as engagements accumulated. Destroyer forces faced an environment that no longer responded linearly to increased application of force. Saturation did not converge toward clarity. It diverged into diminishing returns. The more comprehensive the hunt became, the less informative each additional measure proved to be. The capacity to conclude engagement eroded gradually rather than collapsing outright. Submerged vessels exploited this erosion without attempting to accelerate it. They did not interfere directly. They did not deceive actively. They remained present within a zone where action above degraded its own effectiveness. Time served as their ally not because time healed damage, but because time revealed the structural inefficiencies of persistence without resolution. As such patterns entered collective experience, the definition of escape changed. Escape was no longer measured by exit from area or evasion of contact alone. It was measured by surviving until pursuit ceased to justify itself. Movement became secondary. Duration became decisive. The ability to remain unresolved emerged as a strategic capacity that operated independently of tactical flair. This reframing influenced how success was understood beneath the sea. Surviving an engagement imposed costs on the enemy, even when no damage was inflicted. It forced resource diversion. It prolonged threat perception. It diluted certainty that would otherwise have supported concentration of force elsewhere. These effects accumulated invisibly, shaping the tempo of broader operations without appearing on immediate tallies. The surface forces continued to value closure. Reports favored conclusions that affirmed procedure. Yet the frequency of inconclusive outcomes required accommodation. Allocation models adjusted. Expectations softened. Pursuit thresholds shifted without formal revision. In this space between doctrine and experience, endurance exerted influence it did not seek. The sea itself remained an active participant, though never an ally. Its properties did not change, but their interaction with force did. Pressure gradients absorbed shock. Disturbed layers blurred signal paths. Turbulence retained memory longer than planners preferred. These effects favored the side that reduced interaction rather than intensified it. The submerged vessel aligned with this reality not through insight alone, but through sustained compliance with conditions that others found intolerable. As confidence in decisive resolution waned above, pressure redistributed across planning and training. Emphasis on detection expanded, yet detection without interpretation offered limited advantage. Each additional sensor increased complexity that degraded under disturbance. Meanwhile, simplicity below preserved coherence under stress. The imbalance favored those who accepted ambiguity as operating context rather than flaw. Such adaptations rarely appeared in language of innovation. They emerged as habits shaped by accumulation of experience. Crews behaved differently because different behavior had correlated with survival. Surface commanders hesitated because hesitation had cost less than insistence when certainty proved elusive. Neither side claimed victory in these moments. Both adjusted quietly. The depth escape that had been labeled impossible exemplified this adjustment, not because it altered technology or tactics directly, but because it exposed a threshold beyond which force ceased to compel. By remaining within that threshold, the submerged vessel forced the opposing system to confront its own dependence on confirmation. Withdrawal followed not from defeat, but from diminishing justification. This dynamic did not eliminate danger. Structural limits remained finite. Endurance carried risk proportional to duration. The method demanded discipline equal to any aggressive maneuver. It offered no guarantee, only a shift in probability. Yet within that shift lay strategic consequence, far exceeding its visual simplicity. Over time, the accumulation of such encounters altered the mental map of maritime conflict. Certainty became something to be managed rather than assumed. Engagements were framed with acceptance that some conclusions would remain open. The expectation that pressure would always compel clarity receded. In its place grew an understanding that systems built on action could be constrained through restraint. The destroyers that abandoned the hunt exemplified this constraint. They did not recognize it as limitation at the moment. They responded to metrics that no longer aligned with outcome. Fuel state, priority reassignment, diminishing signal quality. Each decision appeared rational in isolation. Together, they formed a withdrawal that preserved form while surrendering function. Below, the submarine persisted without signal or acknowledgement. Its presence remained hypothetical in reports that avoided definitive language. That ambiguity exerted influence long after the immediate danger passed. It forced opponents to account for shadows rather than targets. It prolonged dispersion of assets. It inserted uncertainty into planning cycles that valued predictability. Thus, in the depths where direct contest gave way to endurance, influence replaced confrontation. Control emerged not through dominance, but through the opponent's inability to conclude. The impossible escape was never celebrated. It was simply repeated. Each repetition stripped a little more authority from procedure that demanded reaction and transferred it to patience sustained under pressure, leaving the mechanics of pursuit to exhaust themselves against a silence that refused to resolve. The refusal had consequences beyond the immediate engagement. It recalibrated assumptions about what constituted success under pursuit and, more importantly, how failure could be concealed within procedure. The surface force did not record defeat. It recorded termination. That distinction preserved confidence while quietly shifting expectations. Each termination without confirmation introduced a margin of uncertainty that could not be erased by subsequent efficiency. Over time, these margins accumulated into a tolerance for unresolved outcomes that fundamentally altered how aggressively certainty was pursued. The submerged crews understood this shift instinctively. They recognized that the opponent's need for closure was structural rather than tactical. The hunt required validation to justify its continuation. Without that validation, effort became self-consuming. Endurance exploited this dependency, by denying the one condition continuation required. Nothing more was demanded than survival long enough for justification to expire. This placed unusual emphasis on internal regulation. Power consumption was managed conservatively. Systems were balanced to minimize internal fluctuation that could propagate outward as detectable change. Human behavior was disciplined to match mechanical restraint. The crew learned to exist within narrow parameters for extended periods, trusting design margins that had once been viewed as theoretical. This trust reduced the tendency to improvise, which in turn preserved the very stillness the method depended upon. In contrast, surface units faced compounding operational friction. Each additional minute of pursuit increased overlap between vessels and redundancy in coverage, which appeared reassuring but delivered diminishing informational value. Coordination demands increased. Communication patterns multiplied. The environment responded by absorbing and redistributing sound in ways that flattened distinction. The more thoroughly the system acted, the less clearly it could perceive. This inversion did not favor innovation above the surface. It favored cessation. Disengagement reduced internal load faster than renewed assertion could restore clarity. The decision to break off emerged as efficiency rather than concession. In practice, it ceded initiative to the unseen vessel below, whose mere continued existence imposed future planning costs. Such dynamics influenced deployment rhythms subtly. Surface forces became more selective about when to commit to prolonged hunts. Thresholds tightened around situations where confirmation appeared attainable within predictable bounds. Encounters that promised ambiguity were increasingly deprioritized. This was not strategic retreat. It was resource optimization responding to experience it could not formally name. Below, the effect was cumulative. Each disengagement reinforced the viability of endurance as response. Crews did not celebrate this response. They normalized it. It became another option among several, invoked when conditions aligned and abandoned when limits approached. Its power did not lie in novelty, but in reliability. It worked often enough to justify continued trust and quietly enough to avoid direct confrontation with established doctrine. The broader consequences extended into planning horizons. The assumption that pressure could always be escalated toward resolution weakened. War at sea became more elastic in its expectations. Unresolved contacts lengthened threat timelines and forced wider dispersion of assets to account for possibilities that survived absence of confirmation. This dispersion diluted concentration elsewhere. The effect was not decisive in isolation, but persistent.
Engineering confidence beneath the surface also deepened. The experience of enduring extended pressure without catastrophic failure validated design choices that prioritized resilience over performance margins optimized for short engagement. This validation fed back into operational behavior, reinforcing willingness to accept depth and duration that had once been considered excessive. Hulls did what they had been built to do. Trust in that function became operational capital. The surface force adjusted differently. Instead of relying solely on escalation, it sought refinement. Tactics emphasized improved coordination and improved sensing. Yet these improvements remained constrained by the same environmental factors that had eroded earlier efforts. The core limitation persisted. Force applied beyond optimal thresholds continued to degrade clarity faster than it constrained the opponent. In this equilibrium, endurance exerted quiet influence. It did not guarantee safety. It did not replace maneuver or deception. It existed alongside them as option grounded in acceptance rather than control. Its effectiveness varied with circumstance, but its presence alone altered calculations above. It introduced the possibility that effort might not translate into outcome, and that the relationship between action and effect was neither linear nor infinite. The destroyers that withdrew carried these implications forward whether acknowledged or not. Their departure freed resources, but preserved uncertainty. Each unresolved engagement left a trace that influenced future risk assessment. The submerged vessel benefited from this residual effect long after the immediate danger had passed. Thus, the escape that had been labeled impossible did not overturn doctrine through confrontation. It eroded it through accumulation. Each repetition reframed endurance from last resort into calculated response. The system that demanded reaction found itself constrained by the limits of its own insistence. The system that accepted pressure found advantage in patience. At sea, Where evidence dissolves quickly and interpretation depends on fragile signals, such advantages rarely declare themselves. They emerge slowly through changes in behavior that appear prudent rather than revolutionary. Endurance became one of those changes. It offered no spectacle. It promised no victory. It delivered continuation. In that continuation lay strategic effect. The inability to compel resolution redistributed initiative. It favored those willing to accept discomfort without affirmation. It imposed costs on those who required confirmation to justify effort. It extended threat lifespans and complicated planning without firing a shot or breaking the surface. The depth escape did not announce itself as lesson. It persisted as practice. Each time it worked, it reduced the confidence with which pressure alone could be assumed sufficient. That reduction mattered. It shaped the balance between action and restraint in an environment where force could not always force understanding. And beneath the water, under stress borne quietly by steel and men alike, survival continued to assert itself not as triumph, but as persistence. Pressure accumulated. Tolerance held. The hunt ended without conclusion. And in that absence of conclusion, influence passed invisibly from those who acted most to those who remained. As the war widened and hardened into routine, encounters like this slipped easily past attention. They produced no wreckage, no prisoners, no visible proof that could anchor memory. Yet their influence accumulated in ways that only became visible when viewed across years rather than moments. They revealed a limit inherent in industrialized pursuit, that systems optimized for detection and destruction still depended on cooperation from the environment and from the behavior of the hunted. When that cooperation was withheld, superiority became conditional rather than absolute. Depth endurance did not overturn naval power. It did not negate escort doctrine or render anti-submarine warfare obsolete. What it altered was confidence in inevitability. The belief that correct application of force would always converge on resolution weakened, replaced by recognition that some engagements dissolved into ambiguity regardless of effort. This recognition reshaped how risk was distributed. Destroyers adjusted priorities. Commanders learned to weigh persistence against diminishing clarity. Pressure was still applied, but no longer with the assumption that escalation guaranteed outcome. For submerged forces, survival acquired strategic meaning beyond the individual hull. Each vessel that endured remained a latent threat, forcing resources to be allocated against what could not be conclusively removed. This effect multiplied across theaters, stretching attention and diluting concentration. Even without attacking, the unseen presence below exerted pressure upward, shaping convoy routes, escort density, and operational tempo. Survival became a form of denial warfare, disrupting control without direct confrontation. The lesson was not that depth was safe, nor that stillness replaced maneuver. It was that endurance could function as an active condition when systems on both sides operated near the limits of their assumptions. Engineering tolerance, environmental complexity, and procedural inertia intersected in ways that rewarded restraint over response. The hull did not need to defeat the enemy's weapons. It needed only to remain intact long enough for certainty to erode. In hindsight, this pattern echoed beyond submarines. Across the war, mature systems repeatedly encountered situations where pressure produced complexity faster than resolution. Strategic bombing saturation, prolonged land offensives, and extended naval blockades all revealed similar dynamics at scale. Force applied without decisive feedback accumulated cost while yielding diminishing returns. Endurance, whether material or organizational, increasingly shaped who could continue. The depth escape stood as a small expression of that broader truth. It showed how denial of confirmation constrained power more effectively than confrontation in certain conditions. It demonstrated that survival itself could alter strategic balance when repeated often enough, not through spectacle or heroism, but through persistence that outlasted procedural patience. History rarely memorializes such moments. They leave no monuments and inspire no simple narratives, yet they influence outcomes quietly, embedded in altered behavior and adjusted expectation. As war moved on, fleets grew larger, technologies more refined, and doctrines more complex. Still, beneath all of it remained the same tension between action and endurance, between systems that demanded resolution and environments that resisted it. The boat that remained deep did not change the war alone. It contributed to a cumulative understanding that not every contest could be forced to conclude. That understanding moderated certainty and redistributed pressure. In the depths, where evidence dissolved and time stretched, endurance proved capable of shaping events without ever rising into view. In an industrial conflict defined by measurement, confirmation, and visible effect. This offered a quiet counterpoint, that sometimes the most consequential outcome was simply to remain.